So last week we looked at Joshua 3, which was the crossing of the river of Jordan. And today we are going to be doing chapter 4, which is the crossing of the river of Jordan. Not quite. It's about the memorial for the crossing of Jordan. God gets them to set up a memorial for this particular event. So we'll read it through. If you happen to have one of the church's black Bibles, it's on page 169. So the memorial to the crossing of Jordan. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up in the place that you will camp tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had chosen, one from each of the tribes of Israel. He told them, "Go to the middle of the Jordan in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone and carry it on your shoulder. 12 stones in all, one for each of the tribes of Israel. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' Then you can tell them, 'They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever.'" So the men did as Joshua had commanded them. They took the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, one for each tribe, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the place where they camped for the night and constructed a memorial there. Joshua also set up another pile of 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, at the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant was standing, and they are there to this day. The priests who were carrying the Ark stood in the middle of the river until all the Lord's commands that Moses had given to Joshua were carried out. Meanwhile, the people hurried, across the riverbed, and when everyone was safely on the other side, the priest crossed over with the Ark of the Lord as the people watched. The armed warriors from this tribe of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh led the Israelites across the Jordan, just as Moses had directed. These armed men, about 40,000 strong, were ready for battle, and the Lord was with them as they crossed over the plains of Jericho. That day the Lord made Joshua a great leader in the eyes of all the Israelites, and for the rest of his life they revered him as much as they had revered Moses. The Lord had said to Joshua, "Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant to come up out of the riverbed." So Joshua gave the command. As soon as the priests carrying the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came up out of the riverbed and their feet were on high ground, the water of the Jordan returned and overflowed its banks as before. The people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Then they camped at Gilgal, just east of Jericho. It was there at Gilgal that Joshua piled up the 12 stones taken from the Jordan River. Then Joshua said to the Israelites, "In the future your children will ask, 'What do these stones mean?' Then you can tell them, 'This is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the river right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were all across, just as he did at the Red Sea. When he dried it up until we had all crossed over, he did this so the nations of the earth might know that the Lord's hand is powerful, and so you might fear the Lord your God forever.'" So I am a person who is constantly overestimating my ability to remember things. I've finally learned this fact well enough to start setting important dates and meetings into my calendar, and with a few good warnings throughout the week ahead for good measure. Even with this mental crutch to lean on, I am still quite consistently being blindsided by little arrangements that fall through the cracks. You would think that with such a spotty track record for remembering important short-term future events, I would have seen the importance of maintaining a good record of meaningful memories in the long-distant past. But somehow I've never really been able to put these two things together in my mind. The ability to accurately recall information from our past is something I think we take for granted far too often. I use the phrase ability to recall information on purpose because oftentimes the raw power of our memory is greatly lacking. This is why, when we need to remember upcoming dates or appointments, we employ aids like calendars and phone reminders so that we can remember to be at the places that we need to be. Even people who enjoy living life on the edge will usually make a mental note, connecting a certain situation with a specific memory, so that they remember the important thing when the right situation arises. For example, I might tie the situation of free time to the memory you have a research paper due, with the intention that being every time I experience free time, I remember that actually I have a research paper due. We use similar crutches to help us remember things in the past as well. Think of photographs, for example. A photograph isn't a memory. It's really just a bunch of different colors on a two-dimensional surface that makes you feel things when you look at it. It's a symbol of a memory. Now, photographs are especially well suited to evoking memories because they accurately capture the same colors and shapes that your own eyes would have experienced at the time. This doesn't mean that they're the only symbols we can use to recall memories, nor does it mean that they're the only symbols that we can use to recall things accurately or vividly. So in Joshua 4, 1-3, when it says, "When all the nations had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 'Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of Jordan, from the very place the priest's feet stood firmly. Bring them over with you and lay them down in the place you lodge tonight.'" All of those things have significance. As far as the numbers are concerned, 12 is basically synonymous with Israel in the Old Testament. If you were an ancient Israelite and you saw 12 of pretty much anything stacked together in an organized way, you wouldn't be able to help but think of the community of Israel. 12 large river stones all piled up. For anyone who had crossed the Jordan River that day, all of the memories would come rushing back. And for future generations, it would stand as a visual testament to the stories they received from their parents and grandparents. We see in Scripture that God often goes out of his way to make sure that his people are remembering him. Not simply what he has done, but what he has promised to do, but actually remembering himself in the present. Did you know that God actually had a certain smell associated with him according to the Old Testament Levitical law? Exodus 30, 34-38 said, "The Lord said to Moses, take sweet spices, stocked onycha and galbanum, sweet spices with pure frankincense, of each there shall be an equal part, and make an incense blended as by the perfumer, seasoned with salt, pure and holy. You shall beat some of it very small, and put a part of it before the testimony in the tent of meeting, where I shall meet with you. It shall be most holy to you, and the incense that you shall make according to its composition you shall not make for yourselves. It shall be for you holy to the Lord. Whoever makes any like to it to use as perfume shall be cut off from his people." See, God had the Israelites use a very particular type of incense that was only ever to be used in the tabernacle worship and was only ever supposed to be associated with him. The result would be that everyone who ever went to the tabernacle to worship would come away with a sense that was only ever experienced in the context of worshiping God. Anytime they caught the sense of any one of those ingredients at a different point in time, the recollections of worship, the feelings of worship, would come flooding back into their memory. It was a smell to remember an experience with God by. Perhaps it's unlikely that you have a certain smell associated with your personal time spent with God, although I do know enough people who have coffee with their Bible reading that there may start to be some associations. But we do have purposeful things in our we should have purposeful things in our daily lives that point us back to God. Maybe it's going for a walk by yourself to pray, or maybe it's journaling, or just a specific time set aside to read the Bible. You can see a major emphasis on being set apart in the religious laws given to Israel. And while we do not live under the Mosaic law, and we're not expected to follow it, that does not mean that we can't learn from the principles that it teaches. If you find that God seems to be taking a back seat in your thinking, and you're dissatisfied with your spiritual life, maybe find ways to remind yourself that he is there. Sometimes I think when we feel that God is far away from us, the simplest fix is to see if actually our hearts are far away from God. While we're supposed to remember that God is in the presence, of course, we also do well to remember that he's in the past. You may or may not be able to think of a specific moment right now, but the very fact that you're sitting here today almost guarantees that you've had a significant encounter with God at some point in your life. From the very first of God's plagues in Egypt, right up until the point where Israel was crossing the Jordan, God was looking out for his people. He was caring for their needs, often miraculously. And he was also instituting in tangible ways for the Israelites to remember these moments. When God brought Israel out of Egypt by plaguing the Egyptians, he gave them the ritual of the Passover so that Israel would always remember that event. Exodus 12:24-28 says, "You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when the children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the peaceable people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but he spared our houses.' And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went out and did so, and the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And so they continue to do. Israel has never forgotten that moment, even up to the present time. The Jews still practice Passover. And we can still read the account of it because God made sure that they would never forget. So now, in the time of Joshua, 40 years later, God has again worked mightily to take care of his people. And he also considers this an important moment, important enough for them to remember. We see that the crossing of Jordan was significant because life for the Israelites was about to drastically change. So Joshua 4:11-14, so we actually keep in the text, says, "And when the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people. The son of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life." We experience different levels of intensity in our spiritual lives at different points in time. There are seasons when our passive faith is put to the test, and God asks us to rely on him for our daily bread. Perhaps we are living close to the poverty line, and we rely on those situations of providential opportunity to get us through the month. Perhaps we have lost someone dear to us, and we must let God fill the void of comfort and companionship left behind. When I say passive, I do not mean to imply that these times are easy in any way. Our ability to rely on God to meet our needs is not the only kind of faith that God works to build in our lives, however. There's also times in which our active faith is put to the test. While God also often calls us to rely on his providence to sustain our daily needs and weather through difficult storms in our lives, there are also times when God calls us to live out our faith in action, often in ways that goes counter to what we would consider safe or comfortable. Perhaps he has put a neighbor or a colleague on your heart and is expecting you to share your faith with them. Perhaps God has challenged your wealth or habits and is asking you to surrender some aspect of your life to him. Perhaps he's convicted you of a particular sin and is expecting you to deal with it in a way that seems radical. While these examples aren't exactly on the same level as going to war over the promised land, they still require us to shift our perspective and take a leap of faith. Even in small things, it's easier to trust God when you have no other option. It's more difficult to trust God when you're actively putting yourself in the line of fire. The stones from Jordan would be a necessary reminder for any Israelite who was wavering in their faith. It would be important for them to remember that they could rely on God when they were preparing for battle. And with an actual physical reminder that God had gotten them this far, they would have that bolstering of their courage that we often need when it comes to faith that we cannot see the final outcome of. Do we have such stones in place in our lives? Do we keep records of the good things that God has done for us? It's possible that some of us have recently stepped out in faith into something we can't see the outcome of. Remember this, Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who God loves, for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." So do you love God? Have you been called according to his purpose? Then know that he is working all things together for your good. Write that on some rocks and pile them up on your front porch if you have to. Write down all the things that God has guided you through, so that when he calls you to action, you can bolster your own faith with the knowledge of all the good things that he has already done for you. We're not supposed to live in passive faith our whole lives. We must answer the call to action. The Israelites were preparing to shift from passive to active faith, faith that God had been building in them every day in the wilderness until now. In the entire period of time between Israel's escape from Egypt right up to this river crossing, God had been working supernaturally to sustain Israel daily. When there was no natural food available, God intervened and fed them manna from heaven. When they had nothing to drink, He caused springs of water to burst from the stones. He daily led them like a shepherd. He guided them as a pillar of fire by night and a column of smoke by day. After all the incredible wonders they had seen in the desert, this particular event might just seem like another Tuesday for your average Israelite by this point. It's easy to forget that with this group of people, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, they had actually all grown up in the wilderness. The entire original community died in the wilderness for refusing to enter the promised land the first time, so their children had only ever known life under God's special providence. Now that Moses had died, they were leaving the barren wilderness and entering a land of prosperity, and so life was about to drastically change. For starters, the people were about to transition out of their life of extraordinary providence. In the very next chapter, we see that God is going to stop sending manna, and they were going to be living off the land from that point on. Second, they were going through a change in leadership. Moses had died, and Joshua was now the human authority over Israel. While both men were faithful to God, this new leadership would have a very different tone to it, because the third thing that was about to change was that the Israelites were crossing over the Jordan to go to war. They were leaving a situation of passive reliance on God to provide and entering a situation of active obedience and dependence on God to see them through safely. Joshua 4:19-24, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did by the Red Sea, which He dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Finally, it is important that we remember God's works because it's our duty to witness to others and encourage each other. The Israelites needed the reminder in order to teach their children about the wonders that God had done for them. So often, God works in our lives, we experience His blessing, and then we keep that personal and never tell anyone about it. The Israelites were expected to teach their children the things that God had done so that they would not forget Him when they were living off the bounty of the land. Before they get here, Moses charges them in Deuteronomy 8. He says, take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that He might humble you and test you, to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. We ought not to forget the works God has done for us. Keep a record of the things you have experienced so that you can encourage others and encourage yourself when you are experiencing hardship. Most importantly, remember that God has brought us out of slavery to sin, and the difficulties we experience are ultimately meant for our good, to build us up and to conform us to Christ's own character. So I'll pray. Lord, I thank you for this church and just for what you've done to build this community up in the last over a decade. I thank you for the work that you've done in all of our lives, and I pray that you would be reminding us of that, and that we would be encouraged to bring your word to others. And thank you for this day, and in your name, amen.